I think it is very important to use corpora. And what's nice about the modern world is that we have access to very large corpora that allow us to look for constructions that might not have been easy to come to mind before. But there's nothing intrinsically wrong or difficult or hard about using a corpus in a nativist approach. All historical linguistics is done using corpora. And it was done before corpus linguistics became corpus linguistics, right? I mean, how else do you work on Latin? Or I've got a friend who does it on Egyptian. So he's got 6,000 years of corpus to draw on, right? This is phenomenal. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's great. But it does have, the disadvantage is you don't get the negative data. And that's just convenience. You can ask someone, hey, is this acceptable? And they can give you a 1 to 5 judgment. That's great. But Tutankhamun isn't there to say, no, I decree that this is undeveloped. So that's difficult about it. Another difficult thing is you've got to define your noise level. So if I find, one example in a 50 million word corpus, does that constitute evidence of any kind? Now, I don't know how to answer that question. It's difficult. How little is too little? And that's something that it's a challenge you've got to deal with. But there's nothing intrinsically problematic. And while I'm on this, I don't want to come. It's an national debate that one is a little bit aggressive towards the opposition. But I actually don't want to. I'm not making the claim that a functionalist approach is useless or that it's wrong or should not be done. I think if you look at the history of the way science develops, there are methods that are useful and methods that are not useful. It depends on what you're actually looking at. And I think to the extent that a functional approach sheds light on phenomena, it is useful and should be used. Right? I've got no problem with that. And so, for instance, give an example. In paleontology, function doesn't fossilize, as you mentioned. Right? So if I find a piece of rock with serrated edges, I look at its form and I infer from it that it must have had a function as an arrowhead or something like that. Right? But and that is totally okay in paleontology. But in particle physics, that is not very useful. Because if you're looking at a neutrino, we do not have access to the thing in itself. And so the only thing we can look at is the way it interacts with other things. Shoot a bunch of neutrinos through, I don't know, in a deep mine shaft, a container full of boron, and we look for the scintillating flashes. So you couldn't then take the more formalist approach and say, well, what is the structure of a neutrino? Because we didn't have access to it. So you have to actually look at the way it interacts with other things. So both formal and functional approaches are totally valid scientific approaches. But they will be more or less useful for particular kinds of things. I think the nativist approach is pretty good at what it does, which is looking at competence. And I'm getting an impression that possibly the functionalist approach might be pretty good at performance stuff, which nativists have absolutely nothing to say about.
Actually, it's interesting that what Mark just said, because O'Grady, in his introductory language acquisition book, at the end, he briefly discusses this issue in language acquisition that nativists theorists think there is a universal grammar, a particular language device that children do, and there's another position that actually think it's emerging and it's construction based. And then he goes on and actually starts saying, well, if you look at the evidence that usually comes from these two different camps, they look at different things and they argue for things that are actually not cross camp like basically. And he just ended there the discussion saying like perhaps in language acquisition like this, both camps might not be wrong actually, and they are not. They might both be actually useful in us understanding what's going on with human language. That's how he ends actually the discussion. And I wonder, Mark kind of said what he thinks about this, but I wonder what he thinks about that kind of view towards like coexistence of these two views, and actually that they're both useful for our knowledge.
The one thing that I think is a fair comment is that people tend to look at the kinds of evidence they find useful to extend their analysis. So if your approach works for one phenomenon, you go and look for the next one that is related. And that shows that you can extend to that too. So it becomes really interesting and challenging if you take paradigm cases in the one paradigm and see if you can make sense of them from the perspective of the other paradigm. So in that sense, I think there's a fair bit of work still to be done, and then to see if they still offer complementary perspectives on essentially related phenomena, and see if we can find that point where they make different predictions as to how the same phenomena would be explained. Mark mentioned that functionists are good at performance and nativists at competence. I think a typical functionist would like to think that they go beyond just performance and also make claims about the mental representations. So then it becomes a matter of what do you define as the thing you try to explain. A useful way of capturing, I think, the difference is exactly the terms possible versus probable. To many people of sort of a formalist background, whether nativist or not, accounting for all the possibilities is an important goal. How is it possible that you can do all these things? And then at some point you'd have, that's kind of in the development of optimality originally, there was the awareness that at some point actually you need to impose constraints on many of these possibilities. So maybe we can do it differently by taking the constraints as the starting point and figure out how they interact. Because any of these generalities at some point has to be constrained in some way or another. Whereas the functionist would say, well, this is possible, but why do you choose this over that? If it's just a matter of having the context in which to do it, then of course it's mere pragmatics. So if that is the case, then it's a matter of definition. So the question for a functionist would be to say, well, it is more than just that. It becomes part of the mental representation of the construction. It's not just a function of possibilities to use this, it's also the way in which we saw the construction. We only use it for these particular purposes. We do not, even though there is a context we can construct, we do not use it in that context. So there are limits on how widely you would use it, and those limits are represented rather than just a side effect. So that's kind of the burden of proof that you would expect the functionist account to have to meet. That it's not just in the external conditions, but the mental representation itself is also constrained by the lexical base or something like that.
Any last questions or comments? We could perhaps ask Mark and Baptist to sum up their position briefly, and then we can all go to supper.
I mean, a lot has been said, so I don't really know which things to hit on. I guess let's start with just to say the whole thing all over. My position is that sorry, this is going to look really bad. My position is that language is something very special, and it's something very specific, not necessarily complex, just very specific. And we don't seem to see the kinds of things that are language-like in other important domains. And so that what we need to do is we need to represent these language structures in a particular kind of way, and that the ability to do that is actually very simple apparatus. You need merge, move, and agree, a lexicon, and some features. And that's all you need. So it's not a complex thing, it's actually a very simple set of axioms which play out in complex ways, okay, as you would expect. And that you could say you have a choice about where you want this apparatus to reside, but that given it is as simple as it is, and given that it seems to me that so many things are innate anyway, it seems to me that the null hypothesis to at least postulate that stuff is innate, by which I mean ultimately encoded in the genome.
Two general points, I think, for this kind of debate to move ahead, we need at some point to clarify what we mean by mere competence and mere performance, and what the area of overlap between the two is. To see if this is a productive contrast to draw, and if there are different principles that structure. Second challenge to advance the debate is to look at the same data, rather than sort of the pet data that suits your theory, because I think generally people do that. To sum up the position, I think it's fairly simple, but in the opposite way of what Mark said. To make as few assumptions as possible about what the structures are, and to see how you can explain the possibilities and the probabilities with principles that are also useful in other domains, in visual categorization, for instance, and other known forms of cognition, to see if the same principles apply. Only if there are phenomena that clearly escape such an account, then you have to sort of concede that this is modular and has to be specially provided for in the human brain in order to understand these properties.
Thank you very much. Just 2 notices. The school will start sponsoring suppers and lunches from tonight. So if you'd like a sponsored supper, you have to go to Fishmongers again. Right? Yeah. Otherwise, you'd be welcome to choose your own restaurant. Right? But if you'd like to come to the sponsored conference dinner, it has to be at Fishmongers. Right? And then secondly, Cara has discovered what the Wi-Fi password is. So if you'd like to do Wi-Fi at any stage from tomorrow on,